This is a course of lectures and discussions on economics. In this conversation, we explore some implications of Lionel Robbins' famous definition of economics, the science which studies the relationship between ends and scarce resources which have alternative uses. That's the standard definition of economics today. You'll find it in every textbook. And I just want to mention one caveat. Robbins didn't actually use the word insatiable in describing human wants. He thought in terms of a hierarchy of wants, which start with the most basic physical wants and then move up the ladder to the more discretionary, imaginative wants, which arise out of our imaginations. But the fact that there was no top rung to the ladder, I think, does make it reasonable to interpret him as saying that wants are insatiable, they're unlimited. And that enables him to set up the economic problem in the way he does, which is the confrontation between these unlimited wants and limited resources or budgets available to satisfy them.
What the Robbins definition says is that wants are naturally likely to expand faster than the resources available to satisfy them. And economics is about the organization you need to make sure this doesn't happen, that the population, in other words, doesn't starve to death. Let's try and unpick this definition of the subject from the two angles of unlimited wants, limited resources. Economists will tell you that unlimited desires is what drive the economic action. But they've actually spent very little time explaining why these desires are unlimited. Instead, they do what so often economists do, which is start with an assumption and work out the consequences. And the classic example of that was the story told by the Reverend Thomas Malthus. He wrote an essay on population, which had a famous piece of arithmetic in it. The population expanded in geometrical ratio, 1, 2, 4, 8, but the food supply only in arithmetical ratio, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, Ricardo later added a refinement, which is also declining marginal productivity of land. But I mean, Malthus didn't actually need that for his own little essay in arithmetic. Now, what was the basis of the geometrical ratio? It was built on an unlimited sexual desire. The arithmetical ratio was built on limited resource, land. Malthus saw no remedy for this situation except what he called moral restraint. Since he saw little possibility of moral restraint, he thought the majority would always live in misery, with population controlled by famine and disease. As we know, Malthus was wrong. Human fertility declined, while agricultural productivity rose. And economics, as a result, became considerably more cheerful as the 19th century wore on. Nevertheless, of course, Malthus does remain relevant under some circumstances today, particularly in poor countries where needs do continue to exceed resources. So Malthus has a place in economics, a very important place. However, two features of his method left a permanent legacy on the way economics was done. The first was fascination with mathematical formulae as giving precision to what at best were conjectures. His second bad habit was to draw large social inferences directly from assumptions about human nature. You make an assumption about human nature, and then large things follow. But the assumption is not, you just assume. Everyone knows that must be the case. And therefore, society is completely left out. You get an individual drive and then a consequence. And the variables that unite the two are not social at all. The post-Malthusian story is much more cheerful than his own story. So you started to get a sense that with declining fertility and increasing productivity, a balance was developing between needs and resources. And so you get into the era of economists like John Stuart Mill in the middle of the 19th century, who started talking about the stationary state in which growth stops. Wants are satiated, in other words, people don't want any more. Bliss has arrived. The idea of stopping growth has always appealed to those economists and others who hated competitive capitalism. And that was true of Mill. What Mill's argument was, look, we're soon getting to a point where people will have enough. There's not going to be any scarcity longer. So why should we continue with this type of society and social organization, which you only get ahead by trampling someone else down, endless competition? We won't need that anymore. We'll be able to live, in a much, much better life in moral terms once we've overcome this problem of scarcity. And Keynes took that up again in 1930 in his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. But nevertheless, despite these kinds of optimistic scenarios, we still now accept the Robbins definition. In our age, modern age of contraception and technical wizardry, we still find Robbins serviceable. He is the textbook definition of what economics is about. The quest for efficiency is primary. And the reason, I think, why Robbins continues to attract the economist is that the basis of unlimited wants has shifted. It now attaches not to population, but to consumption. It's not the population grows without limit, it's the consumption. The desire for consumption grows without limit. With needs satisfied, the focus of economics has shifted to wants, the wants of the mind. And unlike physical wants, the wants of the mind are unlimited because they are located in the minds of the consumer, whose imagination was unlimited. The whole axis of economics, as you can see, shifts from the objective structure of the economy with its sort of resources to individual want satisfaction. And that gives us the marginalist revolution. I would want to argue that the idea of limitless wants deserves the strongest possible critical scrutiny before we give it any hearing at all, because needs are biological, wants are social. So the idea that wants are limitless by nature is nonsense. We want something not because we need it, but because someone else has it. Wants are made limitless by society, and obviously they can then be restricted by society as well. Today, competitive consumption is promoted by advertisers and politicians as the democratic form of happiness. As long as economics pivots on the assumption of insatiability, it can't identify, much less criticize, manipulative institutions like advertising designed to maximize consumption. It's not in a position to criticize them. It just assumes they're byproducts of these limitless desires. It's the assumption that then creates the economic problem. So I think we've got to bear that in mind. On the big question mark about unlimited wants and failure to distinguish between needs and want, then what about the other side of the matter, the resources side? Is it true that resources are as naturally limited as Robbins believed? It's pretty extraordinary that he came up with his definition of the economic problem in terms of scarce resources at the bottom of the Great Depression in 1932, when more than 20% of capital and labor in the industrial world stood idle. Resources were by no means naturally scarce in 1932. Millions of people had time on their hands. There could have been many more resources made available had the economies been fully employed. So once you escape from the basic biology, again, you soon discover that scarcity, like desire, is socially constructed. How can I possibly justify that remark? First, let's point to the fact that scarcity is constantly being created and recreated by human action. War is one of the great engines of recreating scarcity. Wars destroy, and have always destroyed, far more resources than they have created. Had we not had the two world wars, we would be much richer in Europe than we are now. Wars destroyed more physical resources than human resources. Wars are a method of recreating scarcity, the continual recreation of scarcity through war. Second, the notion of general scarcity, as opposed to relative scarcity, pays no attention to the kinds of goods and services whose scarcity is deliberately intended. If 10% of production is devoted to armaments, civilian goods will be 10% scarcer than they would otherwise have been. A lot of expenditure is designed to make things scarce for people. In other words, this, you might say, is state expenditure of some kind, of which expenditure on wars and war preparations have been the most important. Now, you might say, well, that is needed in order to protect societies against enemies or to maintain their security. But that's not an economic argument. I'm just pointing out to the fact that a lot of scarcity is socially constructed. That's all. Third, the notion of general scarcity pays no attention to distribution. You could argue, as many socialists have always done, that it's the unequal distribution of resources rather than the pressure of population which leads to poverty in the midst of plenty. This means that the problem of poverty can't be solved apart from the question of distribution of wealth and income. Now, I think there are big issues here. You know, if you redistributed everything, would you not be actually making societies poorer as a whole than they would be with the current distribution? I think that's something one needs to talk about. But all of these comments that I've just made, I think, are relevant to what went wrong in the run-up to 2008. There was too little mass purchasing power in the economy to sustain the boom, and therefore the boom collapsed. The big fault of mainstream economics is that it keeps distribution off the agenda. Distribution and allocation problems are fused in the same analysis. My conclusion then, we can restate the Robbins formula, unlimited wants, limited resources, in a way that is true. And this is how I suggest we do it. Given competitive capitalism, given the constant recreation of scarcity by human action, economics is the science which studies behaviour as a relationship between unlimited wants and limited resources which have alternative uses. In other words, it can be restated as a useless tautology. That's what I have to say on this particular thing. Tomorrow I'll go on to the other purpose of economics, which is to do with economic growth. Here I'm just dealing with the problem of allocation as it's classically described, and pointing out that it is a tautology. I mean, you can set it up in such a way that it must be so, but to try and actually deduce it from the facts of nature or the operations of the mind, the individual mind, seems to me quite wrong, because you're leaving out all the social determinants. Suppose that what we had was a situation of unlimited resources and limited wants. Would we then need economics? Surely not. There would be more food on the table than people wanted to eat, so they would just help themselves to what they wanted. If they drowned in a sea of gluttony, that wouldn't be an economic problem. In fact, this situation of general plenty has never come about for the world as a whole, though anthropologists have sort of talked about the original affluent hunter-gatherer societies of the Anthropocene age. In other words, there have been situations in history, localized situations and temporary ones, and what they found in those sort of societies is that people didn't actually work very much, especially the men. The women had to go on working, but the men on the whole took it easy. But we've very rarely had situations of generalized wealth. What is easy to imagine, because we've often experienced it, is a situation in which there is a rough balance between total wants and total resources globally, but shortages and surpluses in particular sectors. In other words, as a matter of distribution, not of total quantity. Would there be enough to go around if the rich countries shared their wealth with poor countries? Would it be a good idea to have a global welfare state? Those are questions open. But the question which I started with here was, would we need any economics if there was a situation in which there was general plenty, in which scarcity wasn't an issue? And I say no, we wouldn't need economics at all. In fact, Keynes thought we would still need economics in that situation, but his remark was quite dismissive. If this situation comes about, then economics might become as useful to us as dentists. In other words, you'd still have to take care of the upkeep of the human species, but certainly there'd be no need for economizing